All right, in this video, I'm going to review some important concepts relevant for the debate about what constitutes the good life. So when we're asking this question, what constitutes the good life, we're in the realm of ethics called value theory. Value theory asks some very fundamental or basic questions about what is of ultimate value to us, what matters most to us. And I think asking this question is important for at least two separate reasons. It's important because it helps us orient our lives. So if we reflect on what ultimately matters, we can figure out what we ought to pursue and what we ought to aim towards. And likewise, we'll maybe understand that there's some things we thought were important, but ultimately we need to put them in their proper place in our theory of value. And then I think answering this question is important because it influences our judgments about right and wrong. And that's because it appears like right actions will be those actions which uphold the most basic and important values. And actions will be wrong if they violate those values. So we saw, for example, John Stuart Mill, as an ethicist, has his greatest happiness principle. This is the principle which says the right action is the one that brings the most pleasure and least pain for the greatest number. So here he's emphasizing pleasure. And he's emphasizing pleasure because his hedonism, his theory of value, views pleasure as that which is of ultimate value or most fundamentally valuable. So his ethics upholds his ultimate theory of value. So when we're doing value theory, we're focusing on the nature of the good life. What is the good life? What constitutes the good life? And there are a number of ways that we can drill down and look at this question. So we can answer a subset of questions relevant. So first, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for well-being? What are those things we have to have in order to have well-being? What are the intrinsic goods of life? What are those things which are most basically or fundamentally valuable? What things do we care about for their own sake? And then, are there objective facts about well-being? Are there some things we all have to have in order to be well off? Or is well-being more subjective, such that what makes one person well off will be different than another? All right, so first we have this distinction between necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is something which must occur for an additional thing to occur. So, for example, it's a necessary condition of it snowing outside that it's below freezing. If it's not below freezing, it won't snow. Likewise, being 18 years old is a necessary condition for being able to vote. If you're not 18, you can't vote. A sufficient condition, by contrast, is something which immediately brings about some additional thing. For example, being a freshman is sufficient for being an undergraduate. Nothing else is necessary. So you could also be a sophomore or a junior or a senior. Any of those would suffice for being an undergraduate. Once you are one of those things, you're going to be the further thing. You're going to be the undergraduate. Frequently, there are multiple necessary conditions. This entails that not one is sufficient. So it's not a sufficient condition that it snows outside, that it's below freezing. Because if there's no precipitation overhead, it still won't snow. So there are multiple necessary conditions. Likewise, being 18 is not sufficient for being able to vote because you also have to be a U.S. citizen. If you're 18 but you're not a U.S. citizen, you won't be able to vote. It won't suffice. So here we can ask, what are the necessary conditions for well-being? Or is there maybe a sufficient condition? If there are multiple necessary conditions, then there's a bunch of things we need to have. Like maybe we need to have pleasure in relationships. And if there's a sufficient condition, then maybe there's only one thing we need to have. And once we get it, we just will have well-being. Like maybe pleasure is sufficient for well-being, such that once we have enough pleasure, we will be well off. So here's an explanation of that. We can ask, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for well-being? And there's a debate about this. Some theorists think there are multiple necessary conditions. So there's a bunch of stuff you need to have in order to live a good life. So the good life is constituted by multiple necessary conditions. And then other theorists think maybe there's only one sufficient condition, or maybe there's multiple sufficient conditions. So for some of us, maybe pleasure is all we need. Pleasure suffices for well-being. And then maybe for others, independence or autonomy suffices for well-being. So we can ask, are there multiple necessary conditions for well-being, or is there one sufficient condition, or multiple sufficient conditions? Next, we have intrinsic versus instrumental. When we value something instrumentally, we value it for what it gets us and not for its own sake. This is why it's called instrumentally. We value it as an instrument for getting us other things. I think we value money instrumentally because we care about money in terms of what it gets us. We care about money because it gets us freedom, pleasure. It pays our bills. But if money never got us those things, we wouldn't care about it. When we value something intrinsically, though, we value it for its own sake and not for what it gets us. So we value it fundamentally or basically. So some argue that pleasure is intrinsically valuable. If pleasure is intrinsically valuable, then we care about it independent of anything else it gets us. So when we ask, well, why do you care about pleasure? We end up saying something like, well, it feels good, or it's nice. And we don't say, well, I care about pleasure because it gets me freedom. Then pleasure would be only instrumentally valuable for the freedom it gets us. So our valuing, our chain of valuing, or our hierarchy of valuing seems to bottom out in pleasure on this view. Everything else we care about instrumentally for its role in bringing about the most fundamental or intrinsic value, namely pleasure. All right, and then finally, we can also evaluate the nature of the good life by asking whether there are objective facts about well-being. So if there are objective facts about well-being, then there are some goods that all persons need to have. So there are attitude-independent truths about well-being. There are facts about the human body. For example, we all need to have water and we all need to have food. It's an objective fact because even if we decide we don't need to drink water, our body will still need water. So there's nothing about our mind that can change the fact about the body's need for water. So it's an attitude-independent fact about the body. We can also ask, are there attitude-independent facts or objective facts about human well-being? If so, then a person needs relationships, even if they don't care about relationships, because relationships are well-being enhancing and there's an objective fact about it. And if there aren't objective facts about well-being, then well-being is merely subjective. And whether a person ought to pursue some particular good, for example, relationships, will just be determined by their particular set of values. Some people might really want and care about relationships, and others might not care at all. And since there's no objective fact about it, neither of the two people is right. We just have different attitudes towards what makes life good.